Poor maid ignored the millionaire CEO at the food truck until he whispered, "Still remember me." It was just after 7 a.m. in Old Town Nashville. The streets were alive with the hum of early morning commuters, the hiss of bus brakes, and shopkeepers unlocking their doors. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of roasted coffee and sizzling bacon, drawing a line of regulars to a small food truck at the corner of Pine and 4th. Painted in warm yellows and oranges, Sunrise Bites stood out like a sunrise on wheels. Its handwritten chalkboard menu was already smudged from the busy start. Caleb Walker stood in line, his tailored navy coat unbuttoned, silk tie loose at the collar. One hand held a phone full of unread emails. The other ran through his hair as he sighed. For someone whose name echoed in headlines and boardrooms, this food truck corner felt strangely grounding, real, anonymous. Just as he stepped forward, ready to order, a cheerful voice rang out from the truck. "Morning, folks! Sorry, but we're down to our last breakfast wrap. Only one left." Caleb opened his mouth. "Then I'll take—" But the girl inside interrupted gently, stepping into view with a faded navy apron tied around her waist. "I think Mr. Hargrove here was ahead of you," she said, nodding toward the elderly man with a veteran's cap behind him. Caleb blinked, surprised, then slowly stepped aside. That was Natalie Quinn, not just a food truck worker, but the former live-in maid of the Walker family estate. After Mr. Walker's passing, the mansion was sold, the staff let go, and Natalie used her savings to buy this little truck. Every wrap she served now wasn't just breakfast, it was survival. She turned back to the griddle, her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun, her navy apron smudged with flour. Caleb watched as she carefully prepared the veteran's meal, her hands steady, her voice warm and familiar. "Same as always, sir," she said softly. The old man's eyes twinkled. "You remembered?" "Of course I did. Egg, no cheese, extra salsa coming right up." Caleb stayed where he was, not offended, just caught off guard. No one had looked past his position, past his last name, in a long, long time. As the line moved forward, Natalie glanced at him over her shoulder. "First come, first served," she said, matter of fact like her grandmother used to say in the kitchen. "Doesn't matter if it's a billionaire or a baker." Caleb chuckled quietly. It had been years since someone treated him like a regular person, and strangely, it felt good. Caleb didn't move right away. He stood there for a moment, watching Natalie finish the veteran's order with that same steady patience. When it was finally his turn, he asked quietly, almost reluctant to interrupt the rhythm of the morning. "Just coffee," he said. Natalie nodded, pouring the medium roast into a plain paper cup. Steam curled between them, carrying the scent of cinnamon and fresh beans. "That'll be $2, she said without glancing at his face for long. Caleb handed her the cash, stepped aside, and took a sip. The coffee was hot, strong, no frills, nothing like the artisanal brews served in the glass lobby of Walker Innovations. Somehow, this felt more real. The next morning, the same black sedan eased to a stop at the corner. Caleb stepped out, coat collar turned up against the chill, and joined the short line. When he reached the window, Natalie's brows lifted. "You again?" she asked, one corner of her mouth curving upward. "Guess I liked it," Caleb said, a small, honest smile breaking through as he took the cup she was already filling. "Careful, it's hot," Natalie said. "So am I," Caleb murmured under his breath, then actually laughed at himself. Natalie shook her head, amused despite herself. By the third morning, she didn't even wait for him to order. "Medium roast, no cream, 1 sugar," she said, stirring the cup before handing it over. "Don't think I didn't notice you stirring it exactly after your 3rd sip yesterday." Caleb blinked. "You pay that much attention?" Natalie shrugged. "People like to feel seen." Caleb hesitated, then met her eyes. "Not everyone does it like you." He moved aside, leaving her with that thought. Days turned into weeks. Caleb found himself waking before dawn, not because of meetings or markets, but because he didn't want to miss the small window of time when the truck was still quiet, when Natalie's hair was still damp from the morning shower, when her voice was soft from just waking up. He noticed everything, the way she tied a toddler's shoelaces without being asked, how she slipped a roll to Mr. Lorenzo in his wheelchair, how she hummed to herself when she thought no one was listening. These weren't grand gestures. They were quiet, everyday acts of kindness, and Caleb, who had spent years surrounded by people who measured everything in ROI and quarterly returns, began to crave that quiet. One morning, the rain came hard and fast, turning the Nashville streets silver. Natalie was outside, fighting with the truck's awning as wind whipped her hair loose. Caleb's driver offered him an umbrella, but Caleb didn't hesitate. He jumped out, ran through the rain, and grabbed the other end of the flapping canvas. "You're going to get drenched!" Natalie shouted over the storm. "Too late for that," he said, grinning as they locked the latch together. They ducked under the awning, breathless and wet. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the rain hammering a steady rhythm above them. "Do you believe people can change because of one moment?" Caleb asked suddenly, his voice low and sincere. Natalie blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if your whole life was heading in one direction, and then in a few minutes someone did something, said something, that made you believe it didn't have to stay that way, could that be enough to change a person?" Natalie stared at him for a long moment. Then softly, "If the moment is strong enough, yeah, I think it can." Caleb's jaw tightened as if holding back a memory. His eyes shifted, no longer seeing the truck or the rain, but something far away. "I was 10, he said, living in a shelter outside of Knoxville. My mom had just left, no note, no goodbye. I remember sitting on the cold cement steps outside the food line, crying so hard I couldn't stop." Natalie's breath caught, though she didn't know why yet. "This girl came out of the line," Caleb continued. "She had blonde hair, dirty sneakers, 2 sandwiches in her hands. She sat down next to me like we'd known each other forever and handed me half." He swallowed, his voice quieter now. "She didn't ask why I was crying. She didn't try to fix it. She just sat with me. And before she left, she tore a napkin from the dispenser, scribbled something on it, and gave it to me." Caleb's hand brushed his pocket like he could still feel it there. It said, "Don't forget you have a future." I kept that napkin. Still have it. Natalie felt her throat tighten. For a second, the sound of the rain seemed to fade, replaced by a memory of her own. A skinny boy with a dirt-streaked face and clenched fists. A boy she'd once shared a sandwich with on a night that had stayed with her all these years. But before she could speak, more customers arrived, and the moment slipped away like the last drops of rain rolling off the awning. That night, across town, Natalie sat cross-legged on the floor of her tiny apartment. The place was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street outside. Her brother, Lucas, was in his room, headphones on, humming along softly to whatever music he liked to play before bed. Natalie opened the small tin box she kept under the bed. Her memory box, as she called it. Inside were bits and pieces of a life she had fought to hold together, a broken keychain from high school, a faded Polaroid of her and Lucas's kids, a bracelet from summer camp, a page torn from a cookbook her mom had given her when she was 15. And then, at the very bottom, almost forgotten, was a napkin. It was creased and yellowed with time, the ink faint but still readable. "Don't forget you have a future." Natalie's breath hitched. She held the napkin in both hands, staring at the shaky handwriting. She remembered that night outside the mansion, before she ever worked there, before the world got complicated. She'd gone with a friend to drop off food at the shelter, and she saw a boy sitting on the steps, knees drawn to his chest, face streaked with tears. He hadn't said a word when she offered him half her sandwich. She just remembered sitting there beside him until he stopped crying, tearing a napkin from the dispenser and writing the first thing that came to her mind. "Don't forget you have a future." She didn't even know his name, but something about the boy's eyes had stayed with her, that raw loneliness, that unspoken plea to be seen. Natalie pressed the napkin to her chest and sat there for a long time, the noise of the city beyond her window suddenly very far away. The next morning, Caleb was back at the truck, this time a few minutes earlier. He was dressed the same, navy coat, white shirt, no tie, but there was something softer about him. Less CEO, more man. Natalie handed him the coffee automatically, but her eyes lingered on him for a beat longer. "You're not much of a breakfast guy, are you?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Caleb smiled faintly. "Not really. Not even pancakes. Waffles." "Not even pancakes," he said, shaking his head with a quiet laugh. Natalie tilted her head, watching him. "You know, coffee doesn't count as a personality." That made him laugh. A real laugh. Unpolished and unguarded. It startled him how good it felt. "Touché," Caleb said, still smiling. "Guess I'll have to work on that." "You should," Natalie said. "We serve sarcasm here for free. But you'll have to earn the muffins." By the fourth morning, their banter had become something of a ritual. Caleb would order coffee, Natalie would tease him for not eating, and he'd linger a little too long near the truck, watching her work. He noticed how she never rushed anyone, no matter how long the line was. She called every customer by name if she could, remembered the small details, who liked extra salsa, who was allergic to onions, who needed a little kindness with their morning meal. Caleb found himself staying longer each time, talking with her about small things, the weather, the best barbecue in Nashville, the country music festival coming up that she said she'd never been to because she couldn't take a day off. And every time, Caleb felt something shifting inside him. It wasn't just attraction, though there was that too. It was a strange, grounding feeling. Like the world outside their little corner could spin as fast as it wanted. But here, over a cup of coffee, time slowed down. That night, Caleb sat alone in his penthouse apartment, the city lights of downtown Nashville glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He opened the small wooden cigar box he kept hidden in his desk drawer. Inside were fragments of a life he'd tried to outrun, a photograph of his mother, a bus ticket from the day he left the shelter, and a napkin, crumpled, faded, fragile, but still legible. "Don't forget you have a future." He traced the words with his thumb, all these years, through every deal, every sleepless night, every boardroom victory and quiet failure. That napkin had been with him, a reminder that someone once had seen him, and now he was almost certain it had been her, Natalie. The next morning, the sun rose pale and cold over downtown Nashville. The streets still glistened from last night's rain, puddles reflecting the first blush of light. Caleb's sedan pulled up to the corner again, but this time he told his driver to stay parked farther down the street. He wanted to walk the last block on foot. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and coffee grounds, and for some reason it felt good to breathe it in. When he reached Sunrise Bites, Natalie was already there, tying her apron, her hair in that same messy bun. A few strands had escaped and framed her face, catching the early light. "Morning," she said with a quick smile, already pouring his coffee. "Morning," Caleb replied, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. He watched her work for a moment before adding, "You ever take a morning off?" Natalie let out a short laugh. "If I did, half this neighborhood would starve before 9 Caleb smiled at that, a real one, the kind that softened his whole face. As the days passed, their exchanges grew longer, stretching into quiet conversations between customers. Sometimes Caleb would stay after getting his coffee, leaning casually against the side of the truck, listening to Natalie talk about the little things, the stubborn grill that needed new wiring, the regular who always paid with exact change, her brother Lucas, who she said was brilliant but didn't like crowds. "He's 17, she said one morning, flipping a batch of eggs on the griddle. High-functioning autism. The world's a little too loud for him sometimes." Caleb nodded, taking that in. There was no pity in her voice, just a fierce kind of love. After their mom passed, she explained, it had been just the two of them. "I sold my car, borrowed from a distant aunt, and bought this truck," Natalie said, glancing at him briefly. "It was rusted out, half the wiring shot. Took a year to fix it up. Lucas helped me. He's good with his hands. We'd work late at night, using borrowed tools from the garage across the street. Now," she gestured around the tiny space, "this is our life." Caleb leaned a little closer, his voice quiet. "That's incredible." Natalie shrugged, her movements precise as she plated an order. "It wasn't brave or anything. I just didn't see another option." Caleb looked down at his coffee, his reflection rippling in the surface. "I envy that," he admitted after a pause. Natalie arched an eyebrow. "Envy what?" "That your world is real," he said simply. "My life is all numbers, silent offices, people who pretend they like you because they want something from you. Everything's measured in metrics and ROI, somewhere along the way." He hesitated, his voice almost a whisper now. "I stopped being a person and became a projection." Natalie was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached for a napkin, folded it once, and slid it across the counter toward him. "You're still a person," she said gently. "Just maybe a little lost." Their hands touched as he took the napkin. Neither of them moved away right away. That night, Caleb didn't go straight home after work. He found himself driving through Nashville's side streets, past the lit-up honky-tonk bars, past the river, where the reflections of the bridges shimmered like ribbons of gold. He parked near a quiet park and sat there for a long time, holding the napkin she had given him earlier. It was blank, just an ordinary napkin, but somehow it felt heavier than anything he'd carried all week. He remembered the last time someone had handed him one that mattered. The next morning, Natalie surprised him. "You're late," she said with mock severity when he walked up. "I was afraid you'd think I quit coming," Caleb replied, smirking. Natalie poured his coffee, then leaned her elbows on the counter. "You'd be surprised how many regulars just disappear one day. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. I always wonder what happened to them." Caleb nodded, his smile fading a little. "Sometimes people leave because they don't know how to stay." Natalie studied him for a moment, sensing the weight behind those words, but before she could ask, another customer appeared, and the spell broke. Later that afternoon, a light drizzle began to fall again. Caleb found himself returning to the truck, even though it was nearly closing time. Natalie was wiping down the griddle, her apron smudged with flour, her hair escaping its bun as the evening breeze caught it. "You're back," she said, looking up. "Didn't want to end the day without coffee," Caleb replied, even though they both knew it wasn't really about the coffee. Natalie handed him the last cup of the day. "You know," she said softly, "you're starting to look less like a man who works in a glass tower and more like one of my regulars." Caleb chuckled, taking a sip. "Guess I'm blending in." "For the record," Natalie said, leaning on the counter again, "blending in looks good on you." Caleb's gaze softened. For a moment the street noise faded, just the two of them, the smell of coffee, the hum of the truck's generator. He thought about telling her everything right then, who he was, what he owned, why the world would care if they saw him here. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he just nodded and said quietly, "See you tomorrow." This was no longer just routine, it was ritual, And rituals, Caleb realized, had a way of becoming the only part of the day that felt real. That night, after closing the truck, Natalie walked home through the quiet Nashville streets. The city had begun to cool with the first hints of autumn, and the air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke from distant fireplaces. Her sneakers scuffed softly against the sidewalk as she replayed the day in her mind. Caleb's laugh, the way his eyes softened when she teased him, and that quiet moment before he left when she thought he might say something more. When she reached her apartment, Lucas was on the couch, surrounded by half-finished Lego models. He barely looked up from the small tower he was building. "You smell like bacon," he said matter-of-factly. Natalie smiled faintly. "Perk of the job." Lucas handed her a piece of the Lego structure. "You were late today." "I was talking to someone," Natalie said, dropping her bag by the door. Lucas glanced at her, curious. "Someone important?" Natalie hesitated. "I don't know yet." Later, when the apartment was quiet, she found herself drawn back to the memory box. She opened it slowly, as though it might bite, and pulled out the napkin again. The faint scrawl, "Don't forget you have a future," looked more fragile under the dim lamplight, like it might dissolve if she stared too long. She remembered that boy again, sitting on the steps of the shelter, his jacket too thin for the winter night, fists clenched in his lap. She remembered how she had just sat with him, no words at first, just silence. When she finally handed him half her sandwich, he'd taken it with shaking hands. She could still picture his eyes, haunted, but wide, like a boy standing at the edge of the world. Natalie pressed the napkin flat against her thigh, her chest tightening. Could it be him? She tried to shake the thought off. Nashville was a big city. Plenty of boys had gone through shelters. But Caleb, there was something about the way he listened, the way he hesitated before speaking, like every word had been weighed and measured 100 times before it left his mouth. And that look he gave her this morning, like she was the first person to really see him in a long time. The next morning, Caleb arrived earlier than usual. The air was still dark blue with pre-dawn light, the truck's neon sign glowing like a warm beacon on the corner. Natalie was just finishing prep when she saw him approaching, his coat collar turned up, breath visible in the chilly air. "You're here early," she said, handing him a cup before he asked. "I couldn't sleep," Caleb admitted. "Big meeting." "Something like that," he said, though his tone carried something heavier. Natalie studied him for a moment, then said gently, "You look like a man with too many ghosts in his head." Caleb let out a low laugh, almost bitter. "That's not wrong." He leaned on the counter, staring into his coffee. "Sometimes I wonder," he said slowly, "if the version of me people see out there is the real one, or if I left the real one behind a long time ago." Natalie's chest ached at the quiet pain in his voice. "You didn't leave him behind," she said softly. "You just have to go back and find him." Caleb's eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The street around them was silent, the world holding its breath. That evening, Caleb sat in his penthouse again, city lights shimmering through the glass like scattered stars. He opened the cigar box once more, taking out the napkin and holding it in both hands. His thumb traced the words as memories flooded back, the sound of his stomach growling, the sting of cold concrete under him, the smell of cheap soup drifting from the shelter kitchen, and the girl, blonde hair, a little too messy, her sneakers covered in mud but her eyes bright. She had been a stranger, but that night she'd felt like the only person in the world who cared. Caleb set the napkin on the table, staring at it like a relic. "I think I found you," he said quietly into the empty apartment. Across town, Natalie sat on her bed, laptop balanced on her knees. She had started to search his name, Caleb Walker, but stopped with her fingers hovering over the keys. Did she really want to know? Because she had heard the name before. Everyone in Nashville had. Walker Innovations was everywhere, in billboards, tech conferences, articles about startups, and Fortune 500 lists. Natalie closed the laptop with a sharp click and pressed her hands over her face. If it really was him, the boy from the shelter, then he wasn't just some man stopping by for coffee. He was the CEO everyone talked about. The man whose face had been on magazine covers. The billionaire with an empire stretching across 3 states. Her stomach twisted, and if that was true, then why hadn't he told her? The next morning, she served him coffee as usual, but her smile was smaller, her words a little more careful. Caleb noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Fine," Natalie said quickly. Too quickly. He wanted to push, but something told him not to, that whatever wall had gone up between them would only fall if he gave it time. And so the tension began to build, quiet but undeniable. Natalie lay awake that night, the city lights flickering on her ceiling, the napkin clutched in one hand. Caleb sat alone in his office, his assistant reminding him of a board meeting he didn't want to attend, his phone buzzing with messages he didn't want to read. Both of them were thinking about the same thing, the same night years ago, the same words scribbled on paper, and the feeling that the past was slowly catching up to the present. It started with a flash. Natalie had just handed a coffee to the last customer of the morning when a sudden burst of light made her blink. Another flash followed, then the low roar of tires screeching to a stop at the curb. A black SUV door slammed, then another. Within seconds, the quiet Nashville corner transformed into chaos. Microphones, cameras, and shouting voices flooded the sidewalk. "Caleb Walker!" one reporter shouted, shoving forward. "Is it true you've been living a double life, hiding out at a food truck every morning?" Natalie froze, the paper cup still warm in her hand. She turned slowly toward Caleb, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the noise. Caleb's body went rigid. He stepped forward, blocking her instinctively, his tall frame a shield between Natalie and the flashing cameras. "This is private property," he said, voice sharp and commanding. "You need to leave." But the crowd wasn't leaving. Another reporter pushed closer, microphone practically in Caleb's face. "Is this the woman you've been rumored to be dating? Are you pretending to be an ordinary guy, just to flirt with the help?" The words hit Natalie like a physical blow. Help. Her stomach twisted. She stepped back, nearly bumping into the griddle behind her. Caleb turned toward her, panic flickering in his eyes. "Natalie, you're that Caleb Walker?" she asked, her voice shaking. "The one from the billboards, the one from Forbes." Caleb swallowed hard. "I was going to tell you." "When?" Natalie's voice broke through the noise, sharp enough to make the crowd go quiet for a second. "When the cameras were gone, when it was convenient for you." "It wasn't like that," Caleb said, stepping closer. "Then what was it?" Natalie demanded, her hands trembling. "The man who stammered through his first coffee order, who stayed late talking about my brother, who listened to me tell stories about this truck. Was that all just some game to you?" "No!" Caleb's voice cracked, raw with desperation. "I didn't lie to manipulate you. I just wanted to be seen as me, not a CEO, not a wallet. Just me." Natalie stared at him, chest heaving. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly, she stepped back toward the door of the truck. "Well," she said, her voice suddenly cold, "you got what you wanted. Now everyone sees you." She turned and slammed the truck's side door shut, the sound echoing down the street like a gunshot. The cameras kept flashing, but Caleb didn't see them anymore. He just stood there, rain starting to fall, watching the shadow of Natalie's back as she locked the register inside. When the truck finally went dark, Caleb's chest felt hollow. The city noise around him faded until there was nothing left but the soft patter of rain and the ache in his throat. He took a single step toward the door, stopped, then stepped back again. For the first time in years, he didn't know how to fix something. The next morning, Sunrise Bites never opened. The truck sat on the corner of Pine and Fourth, its shutters closed, the chalkboard menu erased by the night rain. A few regulars waited for a few minutes, confused, before slowly drifting away. By noon, the truck was gone, towed quietly to a fenced repair lot on the edge of the city. Across town, Natalie sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, laptop open. The screen glowed with a Craigslist draft, for sale, used food truck. Good condition, needs love. Her fingers hovered over the post button, but she couldn't bring herself to click. Lucas shuffled in, still in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "You're not cooking?" he asked, voice small. Natalie turned in her chair, throat tightening. "No, baby," she said softly, pulling him into a hug. "But you always cook on Fridays," Lucas said, confusion clouding his face. "That's Mama's melt day." Natalie pressed her face into his shoulder, fighting back tears. "I know," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "I know." Lucas didn't understand about reporters, headlines, or billionaires, but he understood the way Natalie's hands shook when she held him. He hugged her tighter, patting her back the way she always did for him. "Did someone hurt your heart?" he asked. Natalie closed her eyes. "Yeah, they did." On the other side of the city, Caleb sat in the corner office of Walker Innovations. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the space with light, but he barely noticed. His assistant knocked gently on the door. "Mr. Walker, the Zurich investors are on the line for the quarterly briefing." "Cancel it," Caleb said, staring at the skyline. "But, sir—" "I said cancel it," his voice sharp enough to make her flinch. The door closed softly, leaving him alone with the hum of the air conditioning and his own reflection in the glass. The man staring back at him didn't look like the boy Natalie had reminded him he once was. He looked like the brand, polished, expensive, hollow. That night, Caleb returned to his penthouse and went straight to the desk drawer. He pulled out the dented cigar box, took out the napkin and sat with it in his lap. "Don't forget you have a future." He stared at the words until they blurred. "You told me to build a future," he said into the empty room, his voice breaking. "And I did, but what good is a future without you in it?" He set the napkin on the table carefully, as though it might shatter, then poured himself a glass of bourbon and sat in silence as the city lights blinked outside. Days passed. Natalie stayed home, barely leaving the apartment except to get groceries. The sound of morning commuters outside felt like a cruel reminder of what she'd lost. Her phone buzzed constantly. Texts from Rosa, from other regulars, asking why the truck was closed, if she was okay. She ignored most of them. At night she sat at the kitchen counter, staring at the tin box with the napkin inside. Some nights she wanted to rip it up, burn it, throw it away. Other nights she held it like a lifeline. Caleb threw himself into work, and at least he tried to. But every meeting felt empty, every chart meaningless. He stopped going to the gym, stopped answering calls that weren't urgent. James A., his driver, found him one morning sitting in the back seat of the Bentley long after they'd arrived at the office. "You all right, boss?" James asked cautiously. Caleb didn't answer at first. Finally, he said quietly, "Turn around. Take me to Pine and Fourth." "But the truck—" "I know." James nodded silently and drove. When they reached the corner, the spot was empty. No truck, no Natalie, just the faint chalk stains on the sidewalk where the menu board used to stand. Caleb got out of the car and stood there in the cold for a long time, hands in his coat pockets, staring at nothing. The city moved around him, buses passed, people hurried by, but he felt as if he were standing still, frozen in a moment that refused to end. That night, Caleb sat down at his desk and wrote a single name on a piece of paper. Natalie Quinn. Then he picked up the phone. "Get me on the program for the Nashville Small Business Honors Gala," he told his assistant. "But, sir, that's just 3 days away." "Make it happen," Caleb said. And for the first time since the truck closed, there was a spark of something in his voice. Not business, not profit, resolve. The Nashville Convention Center glowed under crystal chandeliers that night. Tables were draped in white linen, silver cutlery gleaming under the lights, the room filled with the hum of conversation and the occasional polite laugh. Natalie hadn't planned on coming, but Rosa, her friend and part-time helper at the truck, had begged her. "You can't just hide forever, Nat," Rosa had said, pressing the spare ticket into her hand. "You need a night out, just one." So now she stood at the back of the ballroom, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, trying to ignore the glittering crowd of entrepreneurs and investors in their polished suits. She hadn't expected him to be here. When the host stepped up to the microphone and said, "Please welcome the CEO of Walker Innovations, Mr. Caleb Walker," Natalie's breath caught so sharply she nearly dropped her glass. Her first instinct was to leave, but her feet stayed rooted to the carpet as Caleb walked to the podium. He looked different, not in the expensive black suit that was expected, but in the way he carried himself. His tie was missing, the first 2 buttons of his shirt undone, and there were shadows under his eyes that no amount of money could hide. When he reached the podium, he unfolded a single sheet of paper, looked at it for a long moment, then set it aside without reading a word. A ripple of murmurs ran through the audience. Caleb gripped the sides of the podium, took a slow breath, and looked out over the crowd. "When I was asked to speak tonight," he began, "I prepared a very nice speech. Charts, bullet points, the usual corporate stuff." A few people chuckled politely. But somewhere between writing it and tonight, it stopped feeling real. He glanced toward the back of the room, and for the briefest second, his eyes found Natalie's. "There's a woman I met not long ago," he continued, his voice steady but softer now. "She didn't care about my title. She didn't care about my bank account. She cared whether I said please and thank you. She cared if I gave up my spot in line to someone older. She cared if I remembered that people matter more than profits." The room was silent now, the usual gala chatter gone, as though everyone sensed something sacred was happening. Caleb's hand tightened on the podium. "And I lied to her." A soft murmur rippled through the audience. "Not because I wanted to trick her," Caleb said quickly, "but because I was afraid. Afraid that if she saw who I really was, if she saw the headlines, the numbers, the name, she'd stop looking at me the way she did when she thought I was just nobody." He swallowed hard, his voice rough. "I don't deserve her forgiveness, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." There was no applause at first. The silence that followed was heavy, a silence that held weight and respect. Caleb stepped away from the podium slowly, without a bow, without a smile, and began walking through the crowd. People turned in their chairs as he passed, whispers following him like wind through tall grass. Natalie stood frozen near the exit, her heart pounding in her chest. When Caleb reached the back of the room, he didn't speak. He just stopped a few feet away from her, his expression open, unguarded, vulnerable. Natalie didn't move. She didn't smile. But she didn't leave either. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, her heart cracked open just enough to let the truth in. The morning after the gala, the sky over Nashville was still deep blue, the horizon just beginning to pale with the promise of dawn. The streets were almost empty, the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel louder, the hum of a lone streetlight, the distant bark of a dog, the faint rumble of a garbage truck. Natalie walked slowly down Pine Street, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her worn jacket. She hadn't planned to reopen the truck today, but something inside her had told her to at least go and sit in it, to remember what it felt like to belong somewhere. When she turned the corner, She froze. The truck was there, and so was he. Caleb stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, coat collar turned up against the morning chill. He looked like a man who hadn't slept all night. When he saw her, he straightened but didn't move closer. "I didn't want to knock," he said softly. "Didn't want to force anything open." Natalie swallowed, her breath visible in the cold air. "You're persistent," she said, after a long moment. A faint smile touched Caleb's lips. "So are you." Natalie stepped closer, her boots crunching on the gravel. For a moment, they just stood there, the rising sun casting long shadows on the empty street. Then Caleb reached into the leather satchel slung over his shoulder and pulled out a folder, thick, formal, stamped with the Walker Innovations seal. Natalie hesitated but took it. Inside were pages of a detailed business proposal, expansion plans for Sunrise Bites, 5 locations across Tennessee, all carrying her recipes, her name, her story. At the bottom of the final page, one line stood out: majority ownership, 51%, Natalie Quinn. Natalie looked up at him, stunned. "You're giving me control?" "Yes," Caleb said simply. "Why would you give that up?" she asked, voice shaking. Caleb stepped closer, closing the space between them. "Because you taught me something," he said quietly. "That love isn't about owning. It's about offering." Then, instead of pulling out a ring, he pulled out something small and silver from his pocket, a spoon, a worn, polished spoon engraved with her grandmother's name. Caleb went down on one knee, not in the flashy, staged way tabloids might expect, but in a quiet, reverent way, like he was afraid she might break if he rushed. "Natalie Quinn," he said, his voice rough, "will you be my partner, in business, in life, in everything?" Tears welled in Natalie's eyes, blurring the street, the truck, the rising sun. Then a laugh escaped her, shaky but real, breaking the tension like morning light through clouds. "Only if you promise to never pretend again." "Never," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. Natalie reached down, pulled him to his feet, and wrapped her arms around him right there in the quiet street, the first rays of sunlight spilling over them like a benediction. For a long moment, there was no truck, no city, no past. Just the two of them finally choosing each other. 6 months later, the little white chapel on the edge of Franklin, Tennessee, was glowing with morning light. The old wooden pews were filled with a patchwork of people from different worlds, board members in tailored suits sitting beside construction workers in worn flannel shirts, baristas with tattoos, and regulars from the truck rubbing shoulders with investors and city officials. It smelled of fresh coffee and warm bread drifting in from next door, where the brand-new Sunrise Bites restaurant had just opened its doors for the first time that morning. At the front of the chapel, Caleb stood at the altar, his usually perfect tie just slightly crooked, his hands flexing nervously at his sides. James, his former driver and now best man, leaned closer with a grin. "She's not running, boss," he whispered. Caleb exhaled a shaky laugh. "I know, still feels like a dream." Then the music began. Everyone turned as Natalie stepped through the chapel doors. She didn't carry a bouquet. Instead, tied with a soft ribbon in her hands, was the engraved spoon Caleb had given her. Her dress was simple, ivory, her golden hair loose around her shoulders, catching the morning light like a halo. Lucas sat in the front row, dressed in a slightly too big suit, grinning proudly, clapping once before remembering to stay quiet. The old veteran from the truck tipped his cap as she passed. Rosa wiped away a tear. When Natalie reached the altar, Caleb's breath caught audibly. "You look perfect," he whispered, "just for her." "You clean up pretty well, billionaire boy," she whispered back, her lips curving. The officiant smiled at the exchange before speaking. "Do you, Caleb Walker, take Natalie Quinn to be your wife, your equal partner, your midnight taste tester?" Caleb's voice was steady now. I do. Every morning, every night, forever. And do you, Natalie Quinn, take Caleb Walker to be your husband, your co-founder, your soft-hearted CFO? Natalie laughed through her tears. I do, even if he still can't cook an egg. Laughter rippled through the chapel. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed her. Not perfectly, not like in a movie, but with joy, relief, and something that felt a lot like home. The reception next door was warm and loud, the smell of caramelized onions and toasted bread filling the air. On the main wall, framed napkins hung like pieces of art, thank you notes from customers, recipes from Natalie's grandmother, and at the very center, the one that had started it all, don't forget you have a future. Caleb and Natalie stood together, hand in hand, looking at it. You were right, Caleb said softly. Natalie turned her head toward him. About what? That I had a future, he said, smiling. Turns out it was you. Natalie's smile trembled, but her eyes were shining. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a moment, with the clinking of plates and the sound of laughter all around them, it felt like the whole world had slowed down to watch them come home. Thank you for joining us on this heartwarming journey of love, second chances, and redemption. If Natalie and Caleb's story touched your heart, made you believe in love again, or simply brought a smile to your face, we'd love to hear from you. Hit the like button, subscribe to your impressive story, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that matters. Tell us your favorite part in the comments. We read everyone. Until next time, keep believing in stories that inspire and move the soul.